Echoes of trauma. Kids crying over deaths they never lived. Asterisk when 6-year-old Samuel Chun woke up screaming about the burning water and clawing at his chest as if drowning. His parents thought it was just another nightmare. But when the child began sobbing hysterically, begging them to tell his wife Margaret he was sorry, speaking in perfect English with a distinct Boston accent he'd never heard before, the nightmare became something far more disturbing. Samuel had never been to Boston. He'd never known anyone named Margaret, and he certainly had never experienced the terror of drowning in freezing Atlantic waters while a massive ship broke apart around him. Yet here he was, a first-generation Chinese-American child living in San Francisco, reliving what seemed to be the final moments of someone else's death with such visceral intensity that his parents could feel the trauma radiating from his small body. What they discovered next would shake their understanding of memory, death, and the mysterious ways that tragedy can echo across time. Asterisk. If stories like this keep you awake at night, wondering about the mysteries of consciousness, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. You're going to want to follow this journey to its unsettling conclusion. Asterisk. Part 1. The INCID's first episode occurred on the night of April 14, 2019, a date that would later prove significant in ways the Chun family couldn't have imagined. Samuel, who had always been a sound sleeper, began thrashing in his bed around 2:30 a.m., his small fists pounding against the mattress as if fighting off something terrible. "Please, God, please," he cried out, his voice taking on an adult inflection that sent chills down his mother Linda's spine. "The water, ... It's so cold. I can't breathe." Linda rushed to her son's bedside, finding him drenched in sweat despite the cool San Francisco night. His eyes were wide open, but unseeing, staring at something beyond the familiar walls of his bedroom. When she tried to wake him, Samuel grabbed her arm with surprising strength. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice now carrying a thick Boston accent. That was completely foreign to his usual speech patterns. "Tell Margaret I tried to get to the boat. Tell her I loved her more than life itself." Linda's husband David arrived moments later, awakened by the commotion. Both parents watched in horror as their son continued to speak in the strange accent, his words becoming increasingly desperate and fragmented. "The ship, she's breaking apart." The screaming ... Oh God, the screaming. Samuel's small body convulsed, as if he were being pulled underwater. "So cold. Can't feel my legs ... sinking ... sinking ... Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the episode ended. Samuel's eyes focused on his parents' faces, and his voice returned to its normal 6-year-old cadence. "Mommy, why are you crying?" Linda wiped tears from her cheeks, tears she hadn't realized were falling. "You were having a bad dream, sweetheart." "A very bad dream." But Samuel looked confused. "I wasn't dreaming. I was with the man who couldn't swim. He was so scared, Mommy. He kept calling for Margaret, but she wasn't there. The water was black and so cold." The family sat in stunned silence as Samuel continued to describe details that no 6-year-old should know. The feeling of icy water filling his lungs, the sound of metal groaning and snapping, the panic of being trapped in darkness while something enormous settled into the depths below. David, a practical software engineer, tried to rationalize what they'd witnessed. Perhaps Samuel had seen a movie about shipwrecks or heard a story that had lodged in his subconscious. But Linda, a nurse who had worked with trauma patients, recognized something in her son's behavior that went beyond imagination. The physical symptoms, the hyperventilation, the muscle tension, the way he protected his chest. These were the responses of someone who had experienced real terror. When they asked Samuel where he had learned about ships and drowning, he simply said, "From the man inside me. He's very sad, and he misses Margaret." The next morning, Samuel seemed to remember nothing of the incident. He ate his breakfast, played with his toys, and chattered about his upcoming school project on dinosaurs. But Linda noticed a change in his eyes, a flicker of something older, sadder, as if he were carrying a weight that didn't belong to his young shoulders. That evening, as they tucked him into bed, Samuel looked up at his parents with unusual seriousness. "Mommy, what happens when people die in the water? Do they go to heaven right away? Or do they have to wait?" Neither parent knew how to answer that question. Part 2. ESCALAT over the following weeks. Samuel's nighttime episodes became more frequent and more detailed. What had initially seemed like isolated incidents evolved into a pattern that consumed the Chun family's nights and gradually their days as well. The episodes always began the same way. Samuel would wake up around 2:30 a.m. immediately, adopting the Boston accent and adult mannerisms of someone experiencing their final moments. But as the weeks progressed, the episodes began to include more than just the drowning. Samuel would speak of memories that seemed to span years of someone else's life. "I should have listened to Margaret about the investment," he would say, his 6-year-old voice carrying the regret of an adult. "She said Hartley was a fool, but I wouldn't hear it. Lost everything in the crash of '07. That's why I was traveling, you know. Had to find work." Linda began recording these episodes, initially to show their pediatrician, but soon realizing she was documenting something far more complex than night terrors. Samuel would describe working in a factory, the taste of his wife's apple pie, the way sunlight filtered through the windows of his home on Beacon Hill. He spoke of Boston neighborhoods with accuracy that amazed David, who had lived there during college. Most disturbing were the emotional responses. Samuel would cry with the deep, soul-crushing sorrow of someone who had lost everything meaningful. He would speak of loneliness, of regret, of a desperate hope that his sacrifice would somehow matter. These weren't the simple fears of a child. They were the complex emotional landscape of an adult who had faced mortality with full awareness of what he was losing. The family's daily routine began to revolve around Samuel's episodes. Linda would sit beside his bed each night, notebook in hand, documenting the words and phrases that poured from her son's lips. David researched everything Samuel mentioned, trying to find logical explanations for the specific details that emerged. During the day, Samuel seemed increasingly disconnected from his normal activities. He would stare at bodies of water with visible anxiety, refusing to take baths and becoming agitated when it rained. At school, his teacher, Mrs. Patterson, noticed that Samuel had become withdrawn, often gazing out the window with an expression she described as heartbroken. The breakthrough came when Samuel began speaking about specific dates and locations. During one episode, he mentioned traveling on the finest ship ever built and spoke of being a third-class passenger heading to America for a new start. He described the ship's luxurious features with the awe of someone who had never seen such grandeur, and spoke of other passengers with names and details that seemed impossibly specific. "There was a man named Olson," Samuel said one night, his voice carrying the Boston accent that had become hauntingly familiar. "Norwegian fellow, heading to Minnesota. Had pictures of his farm. And the Irish girl, Bridget, who was so scared about seeing her brother in New York. She kept her rosary in her pocket." Linda's hands shook as she wrote down these details. The level of specificity was beyond anything a 6-year-old could imagine, and the emotional authenticity of Samuel's accounts was undeniable. The most chilling development came when Samuel began to anticipate his own death. He would speak of feeling the call and knowing that his time was short. He would describe the sensation of the ship beginning to tilt, the growing panic of the passengers, and the terrible realization that there weren't enough lifeboats for everyone. "I helped the women and children first," he would say with quiet pride. "That's what gentlemen do. I made sure little Annie Morrison got to a boat. Her mother was so grateful. She kissed my hand. By the end of May 2019, Samuel's episodes had begun to affect his physical health. He was losing weight, sleeping poorly, even when not experiencing the traumatic memories, and showing signs of depression that worried both his parents and his pediatrician, Dr. Elizabeth Morris. A child psychiatrist they consulted had never encountered anything like Samuel's case. The level of detail and emotional complexity suggests either an extraordinary imagination or exposure to specific historical information, she explained. But the trauma responses are real. This child is experiencing genuine psychological distress related to memories that shouldn't exist. The family faced a difficult decision: pursue medical intervention to stop the episodes, or investigate deeper to understand what was happening to their son. Part 3. The Einvesteion driven by desperation and a growing sense that these Samuel's experiences were too detailed to be purely imaginative. Linda began researching the specific details her son had mentioned during his episodes. She started with the most obvious clue: a luxurious ship, third-class passengers, and a catastrophic sinking that had occurred in the early 1900s. The connection to the Titanic disaster became apparent when Linda cross-referenced Samuel's descriptions with historical accounts. The dates aligned perfectly. Samuel's first episode had occurred on April 14th, the anniversary of the Titanic's collision with the iceberg. The ship's features he described, the class structure, the passenger details, everything matched the documented historical record. But Linda needed more than general historical accuracy. She began searching for specific individuals Samuel had mentioned. The breakthrough came when she discovered passenger manifests from the Titanic in the online archives of the National Archives and Records Administration. There, on the third-class passenger list, she found a name that made her blood run cold: Patrick Michael Sullivan, age 32, from Boston, Massachusetts. Traveling alone, destination, New York City. Further research revealed that Patrick Sullivan had indeed lost his factory job following the panic of 1907, just as Samuel had described. Immigration records showed he was traveling to America seeking work, having borrowed money for the passage. Most remarkably, Boston City records indicated he had been married to a Margaret O'Brien Sullivan, who had died in 1909, 3 years before the Titanic's voyage. Linda's hands trembled as she read Patrick Sullivan's brief biography in a genealogy website. He had lived on Beacon Hill, had worked in manufacturing, and had been described by surviving relatives as a gentle man who always helped others. The website included a single photograph: a man with kind eyes and a sad smile, wearing the simple clothes of a working-class immigrant. When Linda showed David her findings, he initially dismissed them as coincidence. There were over 2,000 people on that ship, he argued. Samuel could have absorbed these details from documentaries, books, or school projects about the Titanic. But Linda's research had revealed something that made David's skepticism harder to maintain. Samuel had mentioned specific passengers Olson Bridget and little Annie Morrison, who were all documented third-class passengers on the Titanic. More incredibly, historical records showed that Patrick Sullivan had indeed been seen helping women and children into lifeboats before the ship sank. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a historian at the University of California, San Francisco, who specialized in maritime disasters, agreed to analyze Linda's documentation. Dr. Walsh's initial response was skeptical, but as she reviewed the details Samuel had provided, her tone shifted. "Mrs. Chun," Dr. Walsh said during their phone conversation, "your son is providing information that isn't widely available. The passenger interactions he describes, the specific details about third-class accommodations, the timeline of events, these match archival documents that most people would never encounter." Dr. Walsh arranged to meet with the family on June 15, 2019, bringing with her Dr. Michael Roberts, a specialist in childhood trauma, and Dr. Sarah Kim, a parapsychologist from Stanford University who had studied cases of supposed past life, memories, and children. The meeting took place in the Chun family's living room, with Samuel's permission to record the session. When Dr. Walsh showed Samuel photographs of the Titanic, he became visibly distressed, his breathing quickening as he pointed to specific areas of the ship. "That's where the third-class dining room was," he said, his voice taking on the familiar Boston accent. "I ate there every day. The soup was terrible, but the bread was good. And that's where I helped little Annie. She was so scared, crying for her mama." Dr. Walsh's expression grew increasingly serious as Samuel continued to provide accurate details about the ship's layout, the sequence of events during the sinking, and the specific experiences of third-class passengers. When she showed him a photograph of Patrick Sullivan, Samuel's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. "That's me," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "That's when I was big. I was so sad because Margaret was gone, and I was all alone." The team spent hours with Samuel, documenting his responses to various historical materials. His knowledge of early 20th century Boston immigrant experiences and the specific details of the Titanic disaster was both comprehensive and emotionally authentic. Dr. Roberts noted that Samuel's trauma responses were consistent with someone who had experienced the actual events he described. "The child is exhibiting classic symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder," he explained. "But the trauma appears to be related to experiences that occurred over a century ago." The investigation team's preliminary findings were both fascinating and disturbing. Samuel Chun appeared to possess not just historical knowledge about Patrick Sullivan, but the actual emotional and psychological imprint of the man's experiences and death. Part 4. The BREA-CODOHH8. The investigation's most stunning discovery came when Dr. Walsh decided to pursue Samuel's specific claims about the passengers he had helped during the Titanic's final hours. The child had consistently mentioned helping a little girl named Annie Morrison reach a lifeboat, and had described the girl's mother kissing his hand in gratitude, working with maritime historians in Ireland and England. Dr. Walsh began cross-referencing Samuel's accounts with survivor testimonies and historical records. The breakthrough came when she discovered a previously unpublished letter written by Catherine Morrison, a third-class passenger who had survived the disaster with her daughter Annie. The letter, written to Catherine's sister in County Cork 3 months after the sinking, contained a passage that made Dr. Walsh's hands shake as she read it. "I must tell you about the gentleman who saved our Annie. A Boston man named Patrick he was. Such sad eyes, but such a gentle soul. When the ship began to tilt terrible, he took our Annie by the hand and led her to the boat. He kissed her forehead and told her to be brave, that she would see her dad again in New York. I kissed his hand, I did, and thanked him with all my heart. He smiled so sadly and said to give his love to Margaret if we ever met her in heaven. I'll never forget that man's kindness. He didn't make it to the boats. God rest his soul." The letter provided independent verification of Samuel's most specific claims. Not only had Patrick Sullivan helped Annie Morrison reach a lifeboat, but he had indeed mentioned Margaret to the grateful mother. The emotional details Samuel had described, the kiss on the forehead, the sadness in Patrick's eyes, the reference to Margaret, were all documented in Catherine Morrison's first-hand account. Further research revealed that Annie Morrison had survived the disaster and grown up to become a teacher in New York. She had lived until 1987 and had given several interviews about her Titanic experience to local newspapers. In a 1982 interview with the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, she had mentioned the sad Boston man who had saved her life. "He had the kindest eyes," Annie had said in the interview. "He spoke of his wife Margaret with such love. I always wondered if he had children of his own. He treated me like I was his own daughter in those final moments. Dr. Walsh arranged for Samuel to speak with Dr. Margaret Foster, a maritime archaeologist who had spent decades studying the Titanic disaster. Dr. Foster was initially skeptical of the case, but agreed to test Samuel's knowledge with specific questions about the ship's final hours. The conversation, conducted via video call, proved to be both remarkable and emotionally devastating. Samuel, speaking in his Boston accent, described the exact sequence of events during the sinking with precision that matched the most detailed historical analyses. He spoke of the ship's band playing "Nearer, My God, to Thee," of the sound of the ship's hull cracking, of the terrible cold as passengers entered the water. Most remarkably, Samuel described specific details about the ship's electrical systems failing, the way the lights flickered before going out, and the sound of the ship's boilers exploding as it broke apart. These details weren't widely known outside of maritime archaeology circles, yet Samuel described them with the accuracy of someone who had witnessed them firsthand. "The boy isn't just recounting historical facts," Dr. Foster reported to her colleagues. "He's describing the sensory experience of being there. The sounds, the smells, the physical sensations. These are the details of someone who lived through the disaster." The final piece of evidence came when Dr. Walsh arranged for Samuel to meet with Father Thomas McKenna, a Boston priest who had researched the spiritual aspects of the Titanic disaster. Father McKenna had spent years documenting the prayers and final words of passengers, and had compiled a collection of accounts from survivors about the disaster's spiritual dimension. When Samuel met Father McKenna, he immediately began speaking about the prayers that had been said as the ship sank. "Everyone was praying," he said, his voice carrying the weight of terrible memory. "Different prayers, different languages, but all asking for the same thing: mercy and peace." Father McKenna's eyes filled with tears as Samuel recited what appeared to be Patrick Sullivan's final prayer: "Lord, if I must die tonight, let me die with honor. Let Margaret know I tried to live as she would have wanted, and let the children be safe." The prayer matched the spiritual accounts Father McKenna had collected, but had never been published or widely shared. Samuel's knowledge of it seemed to confirm that he possessed not just historical information, but the actual final thoughts and spiritual experience of Patrick Sullivan. The scholarly community was divided, but the evidence had become impossible to ignore. Samuel Chun appeared to be carrying the authentic memories, emotions, and trauma of a man who had died in the North Atlantic over a century ago. Part 5, the Sionne Farun Ta Tayo in the story of Samuel Chun, gained national attention when Dr. Walsh presented the case at the International Conference on Consciousness and Survival in October 2019. The presentation, titled "Authentic Historical Trauma in a Contemporary Child," sparked immediate debate among academics, skeptics, and researchers studying reincarnation phenomena. Dr. Richard Dawkins, the prominent evolutionary biologist and skeptic, publicly challenged the findings in a series of tweets and blog posts. "This is precisely the kind of anecdotal evidence that convinces the gullible while completely lacking scientific rigor," he wrote. "The child has clearly been exposed to Titanic-related media and is unconsciously constructing a narrative that appeals to his parents' desire for significance." The confrontation reached its peak when Dr. James Randi, the famous magician and skeptic, flew to San Francisco to personally investigate the case. Randi arrived with a team of experts in child psychology, stage magic, and historical research, determined to expose what he believed was either deliberate fraud or unconscious suggestion. The meeting between Randi and the Chun family took place on November 15, 2019, in the presence of Dr. Walsh and other researchers. Samuel, now 7 years old, was initially intimidated by the stern-faced investigator and his team of assistants. Randi, began by testing Samuel's knowledge with deliberately false information about the Titanic, hoping to catch him in fabricated responses. "Tell me about the ship's red lifeboats," Randy said. Knowing that the Titanic's lifeboats had been white, Samuel looked puzzled. "The boats weren't red, sir. They were white with brown trim. I remember because I helped paint them during the crossing. We passengers weren't supposed to, but I wanted to help." Randy's expression hardened. He continued with more trick questions, each designed to lead Samuel into false confirmations. But the child consistently corrected the false information, providing accurate details that demonstrated genuine knowledge rather than uggestibily. The most dramatic moment came when Randy presented Samuel with a photograph he claimed was of Patrick Sullivan, but which was actually of a different passenger. Samuel studied the image carefully, then shook his head. "That's not me," he said quietly. "That man has different eyes. My eyes were sadder. And he's wearing a first-class collar. I never had clothes that fancy." Randy's team had prepared the photograph specifically to test whether Samuel would claim to recognize any image presented as Patrick Sullivan. His ability to identify the deception based on subtle details impressed even the skeptical investigators. The confrontation reached its emotional climax when Randy asked Samuel to describe his feelings about Margaret. The child's response was immediate and heartbreaking. "I loved her more than anything in the world," Samuel said, his voice breaking as tears began to flow. "She died from the fever, and I couldn't save her. I was supposed to protect her, but I failed. That's why I was going to America, to start over, to find a way to honor her memory." The raw emotion in Samuel's voice affected everyone in the room. Even Randy's assistants were visibly moved by the child's pain, which seemed authentic and profound beyond his years. Dr. Elizabeth Martinez, a child psychologist on Randy's team, noted that Samuel's emotional responses were consistent with genuine, traumatic memory rather than coached performance. "This child is experiencing real psychological distress," she reported. "Whether or not we accept his claims about reincarnation, the trauma he's exhibiting is authentic." Randy's investigation concluded with a grudging admission that the case defied easy explanation. While he stopped short of endorsing the reincarnation hypothesis, he acknowledged that Samuel's knowledge and emotional responses couldn't be easily dismissed as fraud or suggestion. "I came here expecting to debunk another case of wishful thinking," Randy said in his final report. "While I remain skeptical of supernatural explanations, I must admit that this child's knowledge and emotional authenticity present a genuine puzzle that deserves continued investigation." The confrontation had failed to provide the definitive debunking that skeptics had hoped for, leaving the scientific community more divided than ever about the nature of Samuel's extraordinary memories. Part 6. The AFTRMTH today. Samuel Chun is 11 years old, a thoughtful fifth grader who has largely moved beyond the traumatic episodes that once consumed his nights. The intense manifestations of Patrick Sullivan's memories have faded significantly, though traces of that other life remain embedded in his personality like scars from an old wound. Linda reports that Samuel's Titanic episodes began to diminish around his 8th birthday, coinciding with his increased engagement with contemporary activities and friendships. "It's as if Patrick's story had been told and could finally rest," she explains. Samuel still carries those memories, but they no longer control his life. The family continues to work with Dr. Walsh and a small team of researchers who have documented Samuel's transition from being overwhelmed by traumatic memories to integrating them into his present identity. Their research has revealed that Samuel's knowledge of Patrick Sullivan's life remains intact, though he rarely chooses to access it. When tested recently, Samuel could still provide accurate details about the Titanic disaster in early 20th century Boston, though he expresses preference for focusing on his current life. "I remember Patrick, he told researchers during a recent interview. He was very sad, but he was also very brave. I think he would be proud of the man I'm becoming. Dr. Walsh has published several papers on Samuel's case, contributing to a growing body of research on children who display memories of traumatic deaths from previous lives. She notes that Samuel's case shares similarities with dozens of other documented instances worldwide, though few have been as extensively verified or emotionally complex. Samuel's case challenges our understanding of consciousness, memory, and the nature of trauma, Dr. Walsh wrote in her 2023 follow-up study. Whether we explain his experiences through reincarnation, genetic memory, or some unknown form of consciousness persistence, the implications are profound. The Chun family has received thousands of letters from around the world, many from parents whose children have experienced similar phenomena. Linda has become an advocate for families dealing with what researchers now call past life trauma in children, providing support and resources for those navigating similar experiences. Other documented cases have emerged through their network, including 9-year-old Maria Santos in Texas, who experiences traumatic memories from what appears to be a Civil War battlefield, and 12-year-old David Williams in London, who relives the experiences of someone who died in the London Blitz. Each case shares common elements: intense emotional trauma, historically accurate details, and gradual integration as the child matures. The scientific community continues to study these phenomena, though research remains limited by ethical concerns and the difficulty of verifying historical claims. The Institute for Consciousness Studies at the University of Virginia has established a database of similar cases, documenting over 300 instances of children experiencing traumatic memories from apparent previous lives. Samuel himself has developed a mature perspective on his unusual experiences. He occasionally mentions Patrick during discussions about history or when visiting maritime museums, correcting inaccuracies with the quiet authority of someone who was there. His teachers have learned to appreciate his insights while ensuring he remains grounded in his present-day education. Last year, Samuel asked his parents if he could visit Boston to see the places where Patrick had lived. The family made the trip, and Samuel stood quietly on Beacon Hill, looking at the brownstone buildings with recognition, but without the overwhelming sadness that had once characterized his connection to Patrick's memories. He lived here, Samuel said simply. He was lonely, but he tried to be good. I think he would be happy to know that people still remember him. The Shun family has found peace with the mystery of Samuel's experiences. They no longer seek definitive explanations, but have learned to appreciate the profound questions his case raises about the nature of consciousness, memory, and human connection across time. Samuel continues to grow and develop as a normal child, though one who carries within him the echoes of another person's love, loss, and sacrifice. His story remains a testament to the mysteries that exist at the intersection of memory, trauma, and human consciousness. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Samuel's journey isn't the impossible memories he carries, but how a child's heart can hold both the weight of ancient sorrow and the lightness of present joy. If trauma can truly echo across time, then perhaps love can too, and maybe that's the real miracle hiding in the mystery of who we are and who we've been.